Hello there everyone, welcome to Write Better Stories. My name is Daniel Backer and this is my son Lawrence. I wasn't going to make a video today, but I saw Lawrence pacing in his cage and so I decided that it was time. We've got to make another video. So the last few that I've made have been more about book recommendations. This one I'm going to make about writing because that is the purpose of this channel. And today, I guess he doesn't want to make the video. Today, oh my lord. Today, we're going to talk about the writing process. So rather than specific things about story and content, we're going to talk about just what you should actually be doing when you're sitting down in order to create a story. Just some good practices in that regard. And I've touched on some of these things in my other videos, but I think it bears repeating because it does go against a lot of the advice that I've heard out there. And so, yeah, I'd like to have it in several places so that people can see it. And let's just dive in. There's no point in waiting. So I think one of the first things that you should consider is whether or not you want to type or write your story. I am somebody who personally likes to actually write everything out longhand, and it does add an extra pretty laborious part in the writing process. But I think that if you do have all of your writing typed out for your first draft, it can basically make it feel like it's already finished, and so you can end up trying to sort of edit it as you go because everything is polished and looking pretty on that typed out version of it right from the get-go. And I'll talk a little bit later about how the writing process and the editing process should be separate because they use two different parts of your brain. But that's, I think, one of the main reasons that I like to write everything out longhand is that for your first draft, there's no real expectation that it's going to be good, pretty, grammatically correct even, spelled correct, anything like that. But when you're writing and you see the little red squiggle come up, it's almost as if the computer is making that left part, the left part of your brain edit things and see mistakes. And the beginning of the writing process should just be very much about getting a bunch of stuff down on the paper. So I think another reason too is that you don't have Wi-Fi on a piece of paper, whereas you do on a computer. But yeah, I mean, if you're really struggling with that, all the more. Get out a piece of paper, start jotting some ideas down. Now, notice that I didn't say anything in particular about making an outline first. So this is, I think, the thing that I talk about that deviates from a lot of the traditional advice that tell you, especially if you're writing something long, you start out by making an outline of what you want your story to be and then dive in. The reason that I'm against this is that I think similar to the way that typing out your story can give it a false sense of completion or totality before you even start, creating an outline can do that exact same thing. I heard advice once that said that you shouldn't share your work too early or post about it on Facebook because you almost get a little dopamine release in your brain that makes you feel like you've already completed it and then you're less motivated to actually work on it. And I think that this is sort of the same thing, that if you create this outline, you have this false sense in your head that you already know what your story is going to be. And the fact of the matter is you don't really know what your story is going to be. Just because you have this list of scenes that you've decided on your outline, that doesn't mean that any of those scenes are actually going to work. And usually what happens to me, if I try to create an outline and then just fill it in, I feel like I'm creating a Mad Lib or just trying to plug in these ideas to this pre-established framework, and there's no real validation for that framework. It's just a list of scenes that you've created. So if you are completely married to the outline thing, I'm not going to completely request that you stop that, but maybe just as a writing exercise, give yourself the opportunity to free write a lot before creating that outline. And if you're more interested or you want a little bit more guidance on how to do that free writing process, there's a really good book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, and she actually has a lot of different books about basically tapping into your creative muses and getting the juices flowing. And one of the exercises that she has in The Artist's Way in particular is something called morning pages. And it's basically just an exercise where every single morning you free write to just unclog your pipes and just get a lot of information down on the page. So it doesn't necessarily even have to make sense. You could just be writing, I don't know what to write about, over and over and over to fill up about 3 pages is what she says. And the goal here is to just sort of get that left brain out of the way, just keep on writing. That's the only rule, is that you're not allowed to stop and think about it. And so this is a pretty good exercise that you can do in order to unclog that, or another way I've heard of describing it is that like you have a hose that is spitting out water, and so if you have a kink in the hose, basically all of that gets backed up and then it just dribbles out, whereas your goal as a creative is to just open it up, get it as wide as possible, spraying all over the place. If that works for you, then you can think of it that way. But I think definitely in that first wave of writing your story, this is a really, really good process, because you might want to focus it a little bit more than just the free writing of the morning pages from the Artist's Way, the exercise I just talked about. The way that you can focus that and give that a little bit more structure to your free writing is focusing on those concepts that I talked about in the first few videos about character, the anticipation of action, and character change. Excuse me. Those can be your guiding light in that free writing process. And I think especially here, the anticipation of action is something that can be really fun to play with, because you don't even have to know where it's going to go. You can just put something really big and meaningful in your scene, and you can figure out later what the scene is that'll come after that sort of answer to that anticipation of action. But a really good way to do this too is just to write something that isn't completely total, something that does require a little further explanation, but just trusting yourself to fill in those gaps farther down the line. And so that is, I think, pretty beneficial. Another way that I've described it before in a Reddit post is that it's almost like you're preparing your paints on your palette before you actually organize them into a story or start painting. And so for that first wave in the writing process, it's just about getting a bunch of ideas down, scenes, tidbits, little character descriptions, environment descriptions, really just whatever strikes your fancy. And then after you've got a pretty good stack of scenes and ideas to play with, that's the time that you can make your outline. But the outline isn't probably going to look like something that you would make before you started your story in the other method that I am against, because this isn't necessarily going to be a complete outline. This is your time of basically just organizing the scenes and seeing which scene should come before the next one, and seeing if there's any arc that's appearing. If you keep consistent with the characters and the separate scenes that you've been writing, then it should be pretty apparent that certain patterns emerge, and you can get a pretty good sense of which one should come before the next one. And what will usually happen after you've organized these is that there will be gaps, and there's going to be moments that it doesn't really make sense. And so then this is going to lead to a second phase of writing, that you have to fill in those gaps, and then it's a lot easier to fill in those gaps once you have those existing ideas that are already down. So another concept that is really helpful in this first wave of writing that I touched on in another video is something that I learned from an improv class called the process of discovery. And I think when you make an outline before you start writing, you ruin this process of discovery. So the process of discovery, as I learned it in an improv class, was not going into a scene with too much of an idea of what it's going to be about. It's just trusting that emotional side of your brain to just get in there and vomit out something that is going to surprise you. And then once you have that information that surprises you, that's your character, or that's the scene, that's the environment. You can really apply it to many different things when you're writing a story. And so had you been dictating everything beforehand of exactly what your story is going to be, that is more of a left brain pursuit. It's more orderly and logical, and so you can end up preventing those cool discovered details that can end up being a really important part of your story. So you definitely don't want to get in the way of that, and it's something just to keep in mind. And I think most people that have resistance to this just dive in mentality is that it's just too chaotic for them. They don't think that they're going to be able to figure it out. So I would just say, just trust yourself that you're not going to let anything into the final draft that doesn't belong. So again, I think it's the fear of doing this dive-in method is when your editor brain starts to come in and say, oh, but what if something bad comes out? It's like, well, if something bad comes out, then you're not going to use it. You're going to trust yourself in a later process in writing to not include anything that doesn't work. So what's interesting, though, is that by pushing through something that doesn't work, often something that does work can happen. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've sat down to write and I'm writing something and I'm like, oh, this is terrible, but I'm just trying to get words on the page. And then I force myself to fill up a page. And then on that second page, a bunch of ideas that I didn't even plan on start popping out. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is exciting to write about. And then your momentum picks up. So push through some of those bad moments. This is, I think, also relevant to the idea of having a specific word count goal for every day. That's also something that I'm against. Obviously, you do want to give every time you sit down to write a pretty genuine try. You don't want to just write down 5 words and be like, hey, I'm not feeling it, can't do it. But the fact of the matter is some days you're not feeling it, and you don't have to beat yourself up about it or just vomit out 1,000 words or however many words you've decided on your word count just because that you said you should. Some days you sit down and you just don't have it. And so my personal goal every time that I sit down to write is to just show up. The fact that I've shown up at all is that's the only real goal. So I can feel successful even if I don't write anything that's worth keeping, because it's more about that consistency, especially if you're trying to write something that's very long. The consistency is going to be better than any marathon writing session. I think when I was younger especially, and this was applied to my interest in music and my interest in writing, I thought that if I could sit down and write for 6 hours in a row, then I was really doing it. And it was fun at that time to just get all like on adrenaline and be going crazy, but it's not a very sustainable way of doing things. And especially now that I'm working a 9-to-5 job, I don't have 6 hours in any one time to work on any one thing or the energy to do that. So the idea is more to establish just a little bit every day, especially if you're writing something long like a novel or a feature-length script. I don't know if you're really doing yourself any favors by having these marathon stretches. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean if you're in the zone, you should cut it short, but I don't feel like I have to tell you that. If you're really feeling like the creative juices are flowing, then by all means, do a really long session. But once you're done, I don't think you have to push through anything. Just trust yourself that you're going to come back to it the next day. Now, I think this was Mark Z. Danielewski, the guy who wrote House of Leaves. He talks about something called the Jane Goodall method, and it definitely applies to writing in this respect, that Jane Goodall, in order to earn the trust of all of the apes that she was studying, or were they chimps? I don't know. Monkeys of some kind, primates. What she had to do is she had to show up every single day so that she could demonstrate to them that she was not a threat. But what would happen is if she would miss even one day, they would lose trust in her, and she would have to go out and establish her routine all over again. Now, I don't think you should beat yourself up if you miss a single day of writing, because sometimes life gets in the way. But I think it's a pretty fitting comparison to the writing process that was pretty smart on his part to come up with, because if you do have this big project that you're working on and you go a long time without working on it, it's going to be a lot harder to get back into the swing of it. If you've got something that's like hundreds of pages long, how can you hold all of that in your head if you're not returning to it and basically laying down those pathways in your brain day in and day out? So again, don't beat yourself up if you miss a day or two. It's not the end of the world, but you can't really expect to just seamlessly jump into it. And I've noticed every time that I've left a project for a long time and returned to it, a lot of the effort put in when I return to it is just remembering what I wrote, having to reread through everything, which is really frustrating. But what's really cool is if you do get a good process down and a good habit of doing it many days in a row, you sit down and you're just like, boom, I'm there. I'm immediately remember all of these tiny little details that I remembered for myself, and it's much more satisfying. So, what else can I talk about? I had mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about the difference between writing and editing and the different parts of your brain. So this goes back to, I think, especially a first draft. You don't want to be editing too much as you're writing. That's grammar, spelling, wording. Ironic that I should mess that one up. But yeah, it's much better to get a bunch of words on the page than it is to make sure any one sentence is beautiful. So that's going to be in a later draft. And the way that I think of it is that if you're really committing to the editing process, then you don't even know if that sentence is going to end up in the final draft. So why waste a bunch of energy on trying to make it sound perfect and make sure everything's spelled correctly if you might even end up cutting that scene. So it'd be much better to just move on, get other things down. And it's only after you hit a wall, I think, that you should start the editing process. That's usually what I do, is I'll start that basically preparing my paints, make a bunch of scenes, a bunch of ideas that I'm excited about, and then there will come a day after doing that, usually for a couple months, where you're out of ideas. You just don't really feel inspired by any of the ideas that are in that same project. And so that would be a time to basically start the editing process. Start piecing it together into that outline that I explained a little bit earlier in the video. Now, what's interesting is what can happen is that you can also get like editor's block. So after you've gone through a bunch of drafts and you've started editing, you can get to this point where you just don't really feel enthused about doing it anymore, and it's not really a matter of losing steam about the project. I think that this is a very applicable to writer's block, but it's editor's block. You don't really feel like you're improving it anymore because you're changing the sentences and you're sort of losing sense of the pace of everything. This would be a good moment to maybe go back and start writing again. You can restart your creative process and jump to the other side of your brain when you get that editor's block to see if you can add any additional details to the story. And maybe within that second wave of the creative process, you'll end up rewriting the scene that you were struggling with anyway. So hopefully some of that information is helpful to you all. I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. If I have any ideas about the process, I'll definitely put them in there. But yeah, I hope that helps you write better stories. Please like and subscribe, and leave any comments or suggestions for videos that you think I should make in the future, and I would be happy to do that. Obviously, if they're about books that I should recommend, it's going to take me a while because I have to read them, and I've got a long list of books that I'm trying to read right now. But thank you very much for your time. Lawrence, do you want to say goodbye? I noticed you were talking in the background to yourself. So